I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about cats specifically. We'll talk about other animals and humans obviously as we go, but if you can talk about cats specifically and how they evolved, like where exactly they came from, and kind of how they would have eaten, back back evolutionarily, I guess.
Yeah, so my understanding is almost all the domestic cats we have here in this country are descendants of the African desert cat. And the African desert cat is 100% carnivore. When you analyze their diets, it's rabbits, rodents, mice, birds, lizards. I mean, it's just all animal-based food. Um, and so I think if you look at their natural heritage, all of our cats descended from the African wildcat. I mean, I know some of my colleagues think I'm crazy, but I think we should try to minimize the natural max, try to have a natural diet that will, mirror that. And I think the other big thing with cats, it's not probably true with dogs, is when you look at the African desert cat, there's not much water in the desert. So maybe I've read a study, up to 90% of their daily moisture needs comes from the moisture in the prey that they catch. Because it turns out little mammals, are like big mammals, we're all roughly 70% moisture. Canned food is 70% moisture. Dry food is only 10% moisture. So if you put these cats on a dry food diet, they will drink more water, but I don't think they drink ever enough to be fully hydrated. And so if you're mildly dehydrated day in, day out, it puts a strain on the system, particularly kidneys, which depending on what research you look at in cats is either cancer and kidney disease are the top two leading causes of death. So it's an unproven hypothesis that if you keep a cat well hydrated throughout its life, you could maybe delay the onset of kidney failure. It makes sense to
Wow.
me, but I argue with colleagues because not very many people agree with me, but I think it's worth looking at.
Wow, that is absolutely fascinating. Do we know? This is probably debatable. I know I can domesticate my dogs. I don't know if I can domesticate my cat. She is a stone cold killer. She lives outside. She loves eating all the voles on the hill in front of our house. So domestication is maybe going a little too far. But how did our paths kind of converge, and how did we start kind of cohabitating together?
Well, so I don't want to sound like I'm an authority on this. It's not really my wheelhouse, but just for a
Right.
little poking around, I did, like back when in the Fertile Crescent, back at the Egyptians, and we started cultivating grains, and then the rats were such a big problem. So it sounds like that I think that in that Fertile Crescent is where these cats were first adopted, and they're highly held in high esteem in those early farming communities because they wanted to protect their grain crops. And so I think we just started to domesticate them at that point.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. So to explain a little bit the difference between cats and dogs specifically, and what the difference between like an obligate carnivore is versus what a dog is. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so this is my understanding. So cats are obligate carnivores. They cannot survive without animal-based foods. Now, dogs, they say, are facultative omnivores. And they'll point to some things like dogs do have some mutations from like wolves, where they can have more copies of the pancreatic amylase. And so a lot of people in my field will use that to justify the high carb diets that we tend to feed dogs. I don't know. I kind of look at it more like there's some adaptations that probably dogs made as they co-evolved with humans. And as humans were evolving to an agricultural based societies where they're eating more carbohydrates, probably the wolves that they had domesticated, only the ones that were able to acquire maybe more pancreatic amylase copies were the ones that survived to breed, like a natural selection. That's the way I look at it in my mind. And I know there's people that are much better at talking about this than me, but I've looked at some debates about whether canines are true carnivores or obligate carnivores. I guess you could say that they're not necessarily obligate carnivores. I think you can probably meet those amino acid requirements and the vitamin requirements if it's highly supplemented and with with stuff. But I don't know. I still believe like if you look at the natural diet of wolves, which I spent a fair amount of time looking at, I just think you're going to get similar benefits with dogs as you will with cats. Probably not as profound, but similar.
So for somebody who's not familiar, I know this isn't your wheelhouse, but so for somebody that's not familiar with the evolution of dogs versus cats, dogs, you already mentioned it. They kind of like cohabitated with us, and we essentially made dogs. I thought this was really well explained in the TV show Cosmos, where the host kind of talks about how, we basically made this kind of a deal with a wolf where they would get, our scraps, they could gnaw on the bones that we have, they could use the excess protein that we didn't need, and we would get, something that we could domesticate to have around to protect us or to help us hunt. Is that the way you understand that?
Yeah, that's the way I understand it too. And it's interesting, like when I went on my own low carb journey after seeing all the benefits in my patients, and I just spent so much time going through the weeds on this stuff and looking up mouse studies and all kinds of stuff. I was never really able to make it make sense until I read Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Toms. And in that book, he talks about like the Eskimos, and then he talked about these Arctic explorers like Stefansson. And then this is like in the early 1900s. And then when they kind of came back to society in the 1920s, that's after we discovered like vitamin C and insulin, I guess. But and they were talking about how you can survive on an all meat diet, and everyone was saying that's just complete crap. And they did the huge study back in 1928 with Eugene Dubois, in metabolic wards and nothing but the carnivore diet, which I found fascinating. But then I kind of wanted to read some of Stefansson's book on that polar exploration, and it's absolutely fascinating. But what's fascinating to me is when you look at those sled dogs, and how many thousands of miles they did on those sledging trips. And it talks about, they like get a seal for the explorers to eat, but then how they just feed the guts and all the stuff they didn't want, the lungs and the trachea and, all to the dogs. And I was just fascinated that dogs could survive in such a harsh environment and doing such extraordinary, tremendous physical work, but yet they thrive at that. And I guess the whole point, I'm sorry, I'm babbling here, but when you do look at these different copy numbers of pancreatic amylase, it's different in those Arctic northern breeds than it is in, say, like a Saluki that evolved over in the Egypt area. So I just think like they probably, dogs were able to adapt to higher carb diets. The ones that couldn't probably got bred out. But I realize this is not. Did you say Cosmos was the name of that show? I got to look that up.
Oh, it's fantastic. It kind of talks about our evolution and everything from the Big Bang on that happened, and so it zooms out really large and talks about the universe, and zooms in really tight, talks about us and our evolution. It's absolutely fantastic. It's probably like 2014 on Fox, I think it was released, but yeah, it's a fascinating series, and he does talk about like what it might have been like 30,000 years ago when we were up against wolves, and maybe we were competing for the same food, or maybe going against each other, but for whatever reason we just kind of developed this amazing relationship. And back then, 30,000 years ago, there's not a dog. A dog does not exist. Every single dog that we have evolved from whatever that one wolf that started the whole thing, and we would selectively breed them, and so the cute one would maybe be bred with the fast one, and you get that kind of a hybrid. And the strong one that was good in the wintertime up in northern climates, those two would be bred together, and now we've got all these crazy varieties of dogs. But most people, I don't think, really consider that that is not a natural thing, and we have greatly sped up their evolution in just the last, I think, 20 or 30 years is what they think. Can you verify any of that?
Well, so my understanding is, like, I think the hypothesis that this domestication of wolves to dogs took place in probably a couple different places across the world, at separate points. It's interesting, like you say, like this huge diversity of dog breeds we have now. I don't think there's any other species on the planet that has been bred to have so many diverse traits, from size and hair coat to personality traits to the morphology of their head and their jaws. But the thing I argue about with my colleagues is like, I say we should feed them like wolves, and they're just telling me like, yeah, that Chihuahua is not a wolf, that Great Dane is not a wolf. And I get it, but man, I think the physiology is still the same, right? They still don't have salivary amylase, and I've done kind of some deep dives on this. When you look at their gastrointestinal tract, man, it's really similar to people. I mean, when you look at the gastric property, where all the hydrochloric acid is produced and the kind of pH that they can achieve, and the parietal cell density, like how many of these cells in the glandular portion of the stomach that are producing it, and the length of the small intestine and the large intestine, and how like you look at other non-human primates, how they have just such a massive large colon and a big appendix or cecum, if you will. It's just amazing how the human visceral anatomy evolved over the years, and just it's remarkably strikingly similar to dogs and cats. So I find that whole thing interesting. But I guess my colleagues that say that they can thrive on high carbohydrate diets, I just disagree with them. I think they can survive on high carbohydrate diets, but I don't think they're going to fully thrive till we can more closely imitate a species appropriate diet. But Casey, I should just let your listeners know that I realize I'm crazy. I mean, there's a time when I used to try to be normal, but I don't really care anymore. This is my thoughts,